The Kryll Empire had spent 10,000 years perfecting a form of defense that no other civilization in the galaxy had managed to replicate. Not fortifications built from metal or stone, but barriers carved directly into the structure of space itself, massive gravitational distortions, engineered and sustained, that bent the fabric of reality into something no vessel could pass through without authorization. These walls encircled Kryll territory like the boundary of a fortress that had never once been breached, and the absence of breach across that entire span of time had calcified into something the Kryll experienced less as an achievement and more as a law of nature. No fleet had penetrated the walls. No species had found a way through. The Kryll had stopped imagining the possibility seriously enough to plan against it. The system they noticed at their territory's edge registered, initially, as nothing more than a minor curiosity. Sol, a single star, a handful of planets, and a species calling itself human that had not approached the walls, had not tested them, had not even transmitted the standard inquiries that newly contacted civilizations typically sent. They simply watched, which the Kryll found mildly puzzling and not remotely concerning. The probe they dispatched to observe returned with exactly the imagery the Kryll's threat assessment had predicted: small ships, unsophisticated propulsion, a civilization that registered as primitive by every metric the Kryll bothered to apply. The Emperor's dismissal was immediate and complete. Insects, he called them, incapable of reaching the walls, let alone breaching them, and not worth further attention. The humans, ignoring nothing the way the Kryll assumed they were being ignored, continued their long and patient observation. They studied the gravitational architecture, the energy signatures that maintained it, the underlying principles that made walls of this scale possible at all. What they eventually understood was something the Kryll, in 10,000 years of building and trusting their barrier, had never once been required to consider. The walls were not simply barriers. They were also, by the same physical logic that made them impenetrable from outside, cages and cages, the humans had learned through their own long history of building and eventually dismantling their own enclosures, could always be opened from within. The humans made no move against the walls directly, which the Kryll's monitoring systems registered without alarm, since no movement against the walls had ever previously indicated anything requiring concern. What the humans built instead was a network, small, unremarkable satellites positioned with precise spacing along the wall's entire perimeter, transmitting nothing that the Kryll sensors classified as threatening. The scans found no weapons, no unusual energy output, nothing beyond what passed for orbital debris in any well-traveled system. The Kryll cataloged them as exactly that and moved on. The satellites were not debris. Each one carried a single mathematical equation, a fragment of something larger that only resolved into meaning when the full sequence was assembled and activated together. The equations, properly sequenced, would not damage the walls in any conventional sense. They would destabilize the gravitational architecture holding them coherent, not breaking the walls, but folding them, collapsing the engineered distortion inward upon itself and everything contained within it. The humans had not built a weapon in any sense the Kryll's defensive doctrine would have recognized. They had built the precise mechanism required to switch the entire system off, applied from a direction no one had thought to guard against. Ilara's message to the Emperor arrived with the directness that would characterize every subsequent communication between their two civilizations. The walls were impressive, she acknowledged, but not eternal. A flaw had been located, and the Kryll faced a choice between dismantling their barriers voluntarily or watching humanity dismantle them on their behalf. The Emperor's response carried the confidence of 10,000 years of unbroken security. The humans could not reach the walls, let alone threaten them, and the message read, to him, as an obvious bluff from a civilization attempting to punch above its actual weight. Ilara's reply contained 4 words, delivered with the same flat clarity as everything else she had transmitted. They did not bluff. They calculated. The Emperor's order to destroy the satellites arrived within hours of dismissing Ilara's warning, executed by a fleet that approached the wall's perimeter with the unhurried confidence of a force that had never previously needed to consider failure as an outcome. The weapons fired. The satellites absorbed the discharge and continued transmitting their equations without interruption, without retaliation, without any indication that the bombardment had registered as a threat worth responding to. The Kryll scientific teams examining the satellite's apparent invulnerability found nothing in their construction that explained it. No shielding technology beyond conventional standards. No armor capable of withstanding sustained fleet-scale weapons fire. What protected them, in some sense the KRL's instruments could measure, but not fully categorize, was something closer to certainty than technology, a quantum-level confidence, deliberately engineered into the satellite's operational parameters, that they would complete their function regardless of what was directed against them. The universe, for reasons the KRL's physicists would spend the following century attempting to fully explain, appeared to cooperate with that certainty. The Emperor's frustration escalated into a full assault, thousands of ships, every weapon available, directed simultaneously at the satellite network. The barrage continued without producing the result anyone expected. The satellites absorbed everything and kept working, their sequence approaching completion at the pace it had always been following, indifferent to the scale of force arrayed against it. Ilara's final transmission arrived as the sequence neared its conclusion. The KRYL had received their warning and chosen to ignore it, she told the Emperor, and now they would learn directly what happened to civilizations that built walls intended to keep others out without considering what those same walls might eventually do to the people inside them. The walls were not simply walls. They were cages, and cages, she reminded him, could be closed as easily from within as from without. She activated the final sequence. Across the galaxy, observers watching the engagement felt the specific stillness that precedes something irreversible. The walls began, slowly and then with gathering speed, to fold. The collapse did not resemble destruction in any form the KRL's military doctrine had prepared them to recognize. The walls did not explode outward. They folded inward, the engineered gravitational distortion that had maintained their structure for 10,000 years, now collapsing upon itself and dragging KRL territory along with it into an increasingly compressed sphere of distorted space. Ships caught within the collapsing boundary were crushed by forces their structural integrity had never been designed to withstand. Worlds positioned too close to the perimeter suffered the same fate at a larger scale. The empire that had built walls explicitly to protect itself was now, with a horrifying symmetry that no one in the KRYL command structure had anticipated, being consumed by the very architecture meant to keep it safe. The Emperor watched from his throne as his scientific teams attempted, with mounting and ultimately futile urgency, to reverse a sequence whose underlying mathematics exceeded their capacity to fully parse, let alone counter. The equations had been built with a precision specifically calibrated to that purpose, comprehensible enough to demonstrate what was happening, complex enough to remain irreversible by anyone who had not designed them. Ilara observed the unfolding collapse from the human vessel with an expression that bore no satisfaction in what was occurring. She had offered an alternative. The Emperor had declined it. What followed was not vengeance in any sense she would have recognized as accurate. It was consequence, unfolding according to the physical laws the KRYL had themselves built into existence and never fully understood. The folding continued across 3 days before the process exhausted itself, leaving the KRL Empire reduced to a fraction of its previous extent. Thousands of worlds had ceased to exist. Millions of lives had ended. The humans, throughout the entire engagement, had not fired a single weapon in the conventional sense. They had pressed what amounted to a single button, built from years of patient observation and precise calculation, and the galaxy that witnessed the result absorbed a lesson it would not soon forget. Walls constructed to keep enemies out carried, embedded within their very architecture, the capacity to keep their builders permanently in. The KRYL Empire that emerged from the 3 days of folding was not conquered in any sense the galaxy's military histories would have recognized. It was simply broken, its walls, once the central symbol of its unmatched security, now standing as evidence of the single greatest miscalculation any civilization in recorded memory had made. The Emperor, working through grief and humiliation in proportions he had no prior experience managing, sent a single transmission to Earth. What did the humans want? Ilara's reply arrived without delay, and without the diplomatic softening that the magnitude of what had just occurred might have justified. They wanted understanding, she told him. The KRYL had built their walls from fear that something unknown might breach their defenses and destroy everything they valued. What they had never considered, in 10,000 years of building and trusting that architecture, was that the walls themselves carried the capacity to become the destroyer. That was the lesson humanity had needed to teach. Not a weapon deployed for its own sake. A truth demonstrated because no other method had proven sufficient to convey it. The Emperor asked, with the particular bluntness of someone who has exhausted other options, whether the humans intended to finish what they had started. Ilara's answer arrived without hesitation. No, they were not conquerors. They were teachers, and the lesson required for this particular moment had already been fully delivered. What happened next belonged entirely to the KRYLL. The walls that remained were deactivated rather than destroyed outright, opened, not eliminated, leaving the KRYLL technically free to move beyond the boundaries that had defined their existence for 10 millennia. What they had lost was an empire, a sense of inviolable security, the particular confidence that comes from believing your defenses cannot fail. What remained, slowly and painfully accumulating in its place, was something the KRLL had never previously possessed in any comparable measure. Understanding and understanding, they would discover across the difficult years that followed, proved considerably more valuable than any wall they had ever built. The galaxy that watched the KRLL's collapse absorbed the event with a combination of horror and fascination that produced, almost immediately, a wave of anxious diplomatic activity from every other species that maintained barriers of their own. The humans had not fired a weapon. They had not launched a single missile in any conventional sense. They had simply identified and exploited a structural flaw the KRYLL themselves had never recognized in their own defenses, and the implication that any sufficiently studied wall contained a similar vulnerability spread through galactic awareness with predictable speed. The diplomats who arrived at Earth seeking reassurance, mercy, or the secret of the humans' apparent capability found Ilara consistently willing to meet with them and consistently delivering the same message regardless of who asked. Humanity would not destroy anyone's walls. They would not even threaten to. What they would offer was the same lesson the KRYLL had received, delivered through explanation rather than demonstration this time, for any civilization willing to actually hear it. Walls were not safety. They were isolation, and isolation, sustained long enough, eventually became its own kind of cage. The response split along predictable lines. Some empires, absorbing the lesson directly, began dismantling their barriers and opening their borders to trade and travel they had previously restricted. Others responded to the same information by reinforcing their defenses further, adding layers and redundancies that the KRLL's example suggested would not ultimately help them, but that fear, in the moment, found comforting regardless. Ilara extended no judgment toward the species choosing reinforcement over openness. They were afraid, she said simply, and fear was not in itself a moral failing. It became one only when allowed to fully govern decisions that required clearer thinking. She waited, with the patience that had characterized humanity's entire approach to this engagement, trusting that the lesson would propagate through example rather than requiring further demonstration. The KRYLL themselves, broken but genuinely learning from the experience, began the slow work of rebuilding, not as the empire they had been, but as something closer to a community, one that had discovered through painful necessity that connection outlasted separation, and had begun, tentatively, teaching that discovery to others. A century's distance allowed the galaxy to process what had happened to the KRYLL Empire as history rather than immediate crisis, and the KRYLL themselves had used that century productively, transforming from the broken remnant of a fallen power into something the galaxy had not previously had a category for. The KRYLL Concord operated as a federation built explicitly around the principle their predecessors had learned at catastrophic cost. That connection, sustained deliberately and without the false security of impenetrable barriers, produced outcomes that isolation never could. They had become, somewhat to their own surprise, the galaxy's most enthusiastic diplomatic presence, traveling to every species willing to receive them and offering not a warning but an invitation. Their message was carefully calibrated to avoid the moralizing that might have undermined its reception. No species was obligated to dismantle their own walls. What mattered was understanding what those walls actually protected and what they simultaneously imprisoned, because the KRLL's hardest-won lesson was that walls were never neutral. They represented choices, and choices carried consequences that compounded over time in ways their builders rarely anticipated. A human philosopher named Elias, writing from the relative distance that a century allowed, produced the analysis that crystallized the lesson into something the wider galaxy could engage with intellectually rather than merely emotionally. The KRYLL's fundamental error, he argued, had never been the act of building walls itself. It had been the belief that walls could function as a guarantee of safety. Safety, he wrote, was not a condition that could be permanently secured through sufficient barriers. It was a relationship with the unknown, with the other, with whatever future approached regardless of what defenses were raised against it. Walls could protect certain things. They could also simultaneously and inescapably isolate, and isolation sustained long enough became the more dangerous condition of the two. His book's final line traveled through the galaxy with the specific velocity of statements that capture something many people had sensed without having adequate language for. The wall that keeps out the enemy keeps out the friend in equal measure. And a galaxy without friends, however well defended, was a galaxy without hope. The galaxy's relationship with its remaining walls continued evolving in directions that resisted easy categorization. Some structures fell, dismantled by species who had absorbed the KRL's lesson directly. Others grew more elaborate, reinforced by civilizations whose fear had not yet found its way toward resolution. A meaningful number, however, found a third path, rebuilding their barriers entirely, this time designed from the foundation upward to function not as cages but as doors, capable of being opened from either side depending on the actual conditions that warranted closure or openness. Humans participated extensively in this redesign work, contributing the engineering knowledge their original study of the KRYLL walls had generated, not from any sense of obligation, but from something closer to genuine satisfaction in the work itself. They had never wanted to occupy the role the KRYLL engagement had briefly cast them in, the galaxy's executioners, capable of folding any civilization's defenses inward at will. What they wanted, and what the subsequent decades of collaborative design work allowed them to become, was architects. A young KRYLL engineer named Kale worked alongside a human architect named Alara on a wall surrounding a system that genuinely required protection during periods of active danger, but that also needed, equally genuinely, the capacity to open during periods of peace. Kale asked her directly why humanity had not simply pursued the elimination of every wall in the galaxy, given their demonstrated capability. Alara's answer reflected the understanding her civilization had arrived at through the entire engagement. Walls were not inherently evil. They were tools, and tools served their purpose or failed to depending entirely on the beliefs and intentions of whoever wielded them. The KRYLL's actual error had never been the walls themselves. It had been the belief that walls alone could solve the underlying problem they were meant to address. Only connection could genuinely solve that problem, and connection required trust, and trust, paradoxically, required walls capable of opening when openness was warranted. Kale absorbed this with the clarity of someone finally understanding something he had been circling without quite reaching. Humanity had never set out to teach the galaxy to destroy its walls. They had taught it, through the most expensive possible demonstration, to open them. That was the lesson's actual content. Not destruction. Transformation. The generations that followed the KRYLL's transformation watched the Concord become something closer to a template than a singular historical event. Proof that the painful lesson their ancestors had absorbed at catastrophic cost could be translated into voluntary practice by civilizations willing to attempt it. But translation proved harder than observation. Connection, the Concord's diplomats consistently explained, required more than understanding its theoretical value. It required vulnerability, the specific and uncomfortable willingness to remain open after centuries of architectural and emotional habit had trained entire species to do the opposite. Many of the civilizations the Concord approached found this transition genuinely difficult. They had organized their identities, their defensive doctrines, and in some cases their entire cultural psychology around the practice of walling themselves away from whatever they perceived as threatening. Opening those walls, even gradually, and even with the KRYLL's hard-won example available as guidance, produced the specific terror that accompanies removing protection you have relied on for longer than living memory extends. The humans understood this resistance more intimately than most species realized. They had built their own walls across their long history, around individual nations, around personal grief, around historical traumas they had spent generations avoiding rather than processing. They had learned, through their own painful and incremental experience, that walls of any kind ultimately delayed rather than prevented the consequences they were meant to forestall. A young Veth diplomat arrived on Earth expecting to find the fortress that humanity's demonstrated capability against the KRYLL had led her to anticipate. She found instead a planet without orbital defenses, without planetary shields, without any of the architecture of protection that her own civilization considered basic prudence. She asked a human elder directly why Earth maintained no walls whatsoever. The elder, An older woman whose calm carried the specific weight of someone who had thought about this question extensively, answered simply. The only thing genuinely worth protecting was connection itself, and connection could not be walled. It could only be nurtured, deliberately and continuously, through practices that bore no resemblance to defensive architecture. The diplomat remained on Earth for a full year, during which she learned to garden, to listen without immediately formulating a response, to extend trust before it had been definitively earned. She returned to her own world changed in ways that were not physical, but proved equally durable. She dismantled her own internal walls, not the literal architecture surrounding her planet, but the emotional and relational barriers she had spent her career constructing without fully recognizing them as choices rather than necessities. She opened herself to others in ways that frightened her initially, and that she discovered, gradually, did not produce the catastrophe her instincts had warned her to expect. The world she had feared losing did not end when she lowered her defenses. It began, more fully and more genuinely, than it had ever existed for her before. The Veth diplomat's transformation did not remain an isolated case study. Word of her changed approach traveled through her own diplomatic networks, and others followed her path to Earth carrying the same expectations she had initially brought: anticipation of military power, paranoia, fear, the standard defensive posture that most established civilizations maintained as a baseline. What they found instead, consistently, was a garden. A place that had replaced the architecture of suspicion with something considerably more vulnerable and somehow more secure for being vulnerable. Earth had become a symbol throughout the galaxy not of power, but of possibility. Proof that an entire civilization could choose openness as its default condition and survive that choice, even thrive within it. A human child, born into this reality without any direct memory of what had preceded it, asked her grandmother the question that visiting diplomats had been asking in various forms for decades. Why were there no walls? The grandmother, the same elder who had first answered the Veth diplomat's question years earlier, considered the child's version of it with the same care she had given the original. Walls, she explained, made beings forget that they were fundamentally connected to everything around them rather than separate from it. They were not isolated individuals defending isolated territory. They were part of something larger, a garden encompassing every species, every world, every story currently being told across the galaxy. Walls hid that larger garden from view. Choosing not to build them was choosing, instead, to keep the garden visible. The child asked whether her grandmother would ever build walls of her own. The grandmother's answer carried an honesty that avoided the temptation to present herself as beyond the fear that produced such structures. She hoped not, she said, but she was not perfect, and fear could still move her toward building walls in moments of weakness. If that happened, she hoped someone nearby would remind her that the garden remained regardless, that the flowers were still blooming whether or not her fear could currently perceive them, that she was never actually as alone as walls made isolation feel. The child absorbed this with the particular clarity children sometimes bring to ideas that adults complicate unnecessarily. Walls were not permanent fixtures of existence. They were choices, renewable or revisable depending on the chooser's circumstances and courage. She looked out at the actual garden surrounding her grandmother's home, finding no walls anywhere in her field of vision. Only flowers. And she decided, with the simple confidence of childhood conviction, that this was exactly how things should remain. The galaxy's relationship with its remaining barriers continued its gradual transformation, though not universally or without resistance. Some species, their fear too deeply established to dislodge through example alone, maintained their walls with increasing rather than decreasing intensity. But the overall trajectory favored openness, and the KRLL Concord, once the architects of the galaxy's most formidable barriers, had become, through their own hard transformation, the galaxy's most capable architects of the alternative. They specialized, increasingly, in teaching other civilizations how to convert barriers into something closer to gateways, structures that maintain the capacity for protection during genuine emergencies while defaulting, in ordinary circumstances, toward openness rather than enclosure. A young KRLL engineer named Sora was assigned to work with a species called the Zorn, who had maintained an unbroken wall around their territory for millennia and had not, in all that time, sent a single ship beyond it. Sora approached the assignment with a patience that her training had specifically cultivated for exactly this kind of resistant case. She did not argue with the Zorn's fear or attempt to dismantle their psychological defenses through direct confrontation. She simply began planting a garden immediately outside their wall's perimeter, visible from whatever monitoring systems the Zorn maintained, and told them, through the limited communication channel their wall permitted, what waited for them beyond their barrier. Not enemies. Flowers. The Zorn watched the garden develop over months, and then years with evident confusion that gradually, almost imperceptibly, shifted towards something else. Why would anyone construct something beautiful outside a wall built explicitly to keep threats at bay? The garden made no sense within their existing framework for understanding the universe beyond their territory, and the dissonance that confusion produced eventually opened a small crack in assumptions that had otherwise remained entirely sealed for thousands of years. After a decade of Sora's patient, undemanding presence, the Zorn opened their wall. They stepped, for the first time in their civilization's recorded memory, into the world they had spent millennia defending themselves against. They found a garden, exactly as promised, and they wept, not from disappointment, but from the specific grief of recognizing how much beauty their fear had cost them across all those centuries of unnecessary isolation. They joined the Concord shortly afterward. They became, with the particular enthusiasm of converts who deeply understand what they nearly missed, gardeners themselves. And the wall that had once protected them from a threat that had never actually existed became, in their own telling of their history, a monument not to the fear that had built it, but to the courage that had eventually allowed them to walk through it. The Zorn's transformation, documented and shared throughout the galaxy with the specific detail that made abstract lessons feel concrete and achievable, inspired a wave of similar transitions among other historically isolated species. More walls opened, more beings stepped, with varying degrees of trepidation, into gardens that had been patiently grown and maintained outside their previous boundaries. The galaxy, which had organized itself for so long around the architecture of division, found itself increasingly connected instead by the architecture of cultivation. The humans who had initiated this entire extended process watched its continued unfolding with a satisfaction that remained, consistently, quiet rather than triumphant. They had never wanted to be remembered as the galaxy's destroyers of walls. They had wanted, and had largely succeeded in becoming, something closer to its gardeners, the civilization that had demonstrated, through whatever combination of capability and restraint the situation required, that a different relationship with barriers was genuinely possible. A human historian named Kryll, sharing a name with figures from earlier in this extended story without sharing their specific identity, wrote a comprehensive account titled The Garden After the Wall, tracing the galaxy's transformation from its starting point of pervasive isolation through its gradual, uneven, but genuine movement toward connection. His conclusion reframed the entire human role in terms more modest than the galaxy's prevailing narrative typically assigned them. Humanity had not functioned as teachers in any formal sense, he argued. They had functioned as gardeners, planting seeds and demonstrating possibility, but never directing what other civilizations chose to do with what had been planted. The growth that followed belonged entirely to the species that chose to cultivate it. His book's closing line became something close to a galactic motto, repeated in contexts far beyond its original academic framing. The wall was not the end of a civilization's story. It was properly understood, the beginning of its garden. The galaxy that had once measured its security in the height and impermeability of its barriers now measured something else entirely, the breadth and vitality of what grew once those barriers learned to open. The structures that remained were no longer experienced as cages. They had become arches, gates, doors, available to anyone who chose, when the moment was right, to walk through them. What had begun as a lethal lesson, demonstrated through the collapse of an empire that had refused to listen, had transformed gradually into something closer to a living gift, and the galaxy, after generations of difficult and uneven progress, had finally found something approaching genuine peace with itself. 1,000 years of accumulated transformation had reshaped the galaxy into something the original architects of the KRWL's walls would have found entirely unrecognizable. The empire that had once measured its security in gravitational barriers existed now only in historical record, replaced by the KRWL Concord, a thriving federation built on principles its predecessors would have considered suicidal naivety. The Zorn, once the galaxy's most thoroughly isolated species, had become some of its most enthusiastic gardeners, traveling between worlds to share techniques and seeds with anyone willing to receive them. The humans who had set this entire trajectory in motion had settled into a role considerably quieter than their initial demonstration of capability might have suggested, elders now, speaking rarely, listening consistently, present throughout the galaxy's continued evolution without dominating any portion of it. The walls that remained had transformed architecturally as thoroughly as the cultures they once protected. They stood now as arches, open structures retaining the visual memory of their original defensive purpose while functioning, in practice, as invitations to passage rather than obstacles preventing it. Climbing roses had taken root along many of them, an aesthetic choice that had become so widespread it functioned almost as a galactic convention. The Gardens of Connection, as these collaborative spaces came to be universally known, had spread across 1,000 worlds, present in nearly every population center significant enough to support one, places where beings from any species could simply sit together, sharing space and silence without any requirement to perform connection rather than simply experience it. A young human woman named Alara, the name having traveled forward through enough generations that its bearers understood themselves as participants in an ongoing lineage rather than merely individuals, visited one of these gardens during a period of reflection in her own life. She sat on a stone bench surrounded by flowers gathered from 100 different worlds and felt something that exceeded connection to any single being present. She felt connected, somehow, to the accumulated whole of everyone who had ever contributed to this particular space's existence. A KRYLL elder settled beside her without requesting permission, the casual familiarity of someone entirely at home in this setting. Her ancestors, he told her, had taught his people a lesson, a genuinely lethal one, never forgotten despite the centuries that had since passed. She nodded, acknowledging the shared weight of that history. Neither had humanity forgotten it, she told him. They carried it forward not as a threat held in reserve, but as a reminder of what walls were actually capable of becoming, and what gardens, by contrast, could heal. The elder offered that the humans had taught his people more than they perhaps fully understood. She corrected him gently. They had taught themselves. Humanity had only planted seeds. The KRYLL themselves had grown the actual garden. He wept at this, not from sorrow but from the specific recognition of having been, all along, an essential part of something larger than his own individual contribution, and that recognition, arriving after 1,000 years of cumulative growth, was entirely sufficient. The Gardens of Connection had become, across the centuries of their development, the galaxy's most genuinely sacred spaces, sacred not through any formal religious designation, but through the simpler and more demanding quality of truthfulness they consistently produced in whoever entered them. Within their boundaries, the defensive postures that most beings maintained as habitual protection tended to dissolve, not through any active mechanism, but through the simple absence of anything requiring continued defense. Visitors found themselves, gradually and without quite intending it, simply present as themselves. A Veth poet had captured this quality in a verse now carved into the entrance of nearly every garden across the galaxy's network. Here there were no walls, only presence, only truth, only connection. Visitors read these words before entering and found, consistently, that the words described accurately what awaited them inside, which was rarer and more valuable than poetry usually managed to achieve. A human man named Kale arrived at one such garden carrying a grief that had no obvious resolution available to it, a personal loss substantial enough that he had found himself, in the weeks since, essentially unable to function within his previous routines. He sat on a bench within the garden and wept without restraint, and what he encountered in response was neither intervention nor advice. No one approached him directly. No one attempted conversation. But he felt, distinctly and without being able to fully explain the mechanism, held by the garden itself, by the quiet presence of others scattered throughout it who were similarly absorbed in whatever they had each brought there, by the accumulated silence that asked nothing of him beyond simply continuing to exist within it. He remained for 3 days. When he eventually left, he was not healed in any sense that resolved his actual loss. He was held, which proved to be a related but distinctly different condition, and one his grief had genuinely required without his having previously understood that requirement. He returned to his own world, having learned something the garden had demonstrated without ever explaining it directly, that grief functioned not as a wall requiring breach, but as a garden requiring tending, ongoing and patient, rather than resolution and completion. He planted a garden of his own afterward, modest in scale, contained within his own backyard. He tended it daily across the following years. He wept there when weeping was what the moment required, and he laughed there when laughter eventually became available again, and he discovered, through the accumulated practice of simply showing up to tend something living, a form of peace that did not require the absence of grief to function. What he had found was not the absence of loss. It was the continued, ongoing presence of life alongside it. The garden, he concluded, had been the actual answer all along, not the wall he might once have built instead. The function the gardens of connection served extended well beyond individual healing into something closer to galactic infrastructure for resolving conflicts that had previously required formal diplomatic mechanisms, or, in the era before the Kryll's transformation, military engagement. Diplomats representing species with long-standing hostilities began using the gardens deliberately, bringing adversaries together not to negotiate directly but simply to sit, in shared silence, until whatever the silence eventually produced became available to work with. A Kryll and a Veth, representing populations that had maintained active hostility for centuries, sat together within one such garden for a full week without exchanging a single word. On the 8th day, conversation finally began, not about the conflict that had brought them together, but about their respective children, their personal gardens back home, the modest hopes that occupied their private thoughts when official animosity was not actively required of them. They discovered, through this unplanned and unguided conversation, considerably more shared ground than the formal points of dispute had ever suggested existed. They signed an agreement that evening, though it bore little resemblance to the surrender documents or territorial settlements that had concluded previous conflicts between their peoples. It was instead a treaty of friendship, an agreement to continue the connection their week of shared silence had unexpectedly produced rather than returning to the hostilities that had defined their relationship beforehand. Senna, the human gardener who had designed and maintained this particular space, observed the entire process from a respectful distance and declined, consistently, to accept credit for the outcome when both parties attempted to offer it. The garden had done this, she insisted, not her own design choices. They countered that she had planted the seeds and provided the space in which growth became possible. She acknowledged this much, but maintained the more important distinction. She had provided a space. They had chosen within that space to grow. That choice, she told them, was the only element of the entire process that genuinely mattered. The treaty became a model adopted across the galaxy, and the gardens accumulated a reputation as the most effective available mechanism for resolving conflicts that conventional diplomacy had repeatedly failed to address. The galaxy, organized for so long around the architecture of division, found itself increasingly defined instead by the practice of cultivation. And the humans, throughout this evolving process, continued emphasizing the distinction they considered most essential to preserve. Gardens were not simply places visitors occasionally entered. They were practices requiring sustained, deliberate engagement to function, and that distinction, more than any other single insight, was what they had ultimately offered the galaxy to learn from. The garden's expansion eventually reached locations that their original conception would have found difficult to anticipate: former battlefields, the ruins of cities that war had once leveled, the literal foundations of structures that had previously served as walled fortresses before transformation reached even their physical remains. They were tended consistently by collaborative efforts spanning multiple species working alongside one another, learning the specific practices of cultivation together in ways that mirrored the broader cultural transformation occurring throughout galactic civilization. The gardens were not, in their accumulated reality, perfect or permanently self-sustaining. Some suffered periods of neglect when local circumstances drew attention elsewhere. A few experienced vandalism from individuals whose personal struggles had not yet found resolution through the broader cultural shift surrounding them. But consistently, eventually, someone arrived to resume the tending, planting a replacement seed, watering soil that had gone dry, simply sitting in silence long enough to remind the garden, and themselves, that it remained alive and worth maintaining. A young human girl, born on a world that carried the specific history of having once served as a Kryll military fortress before its eventual transformation, asked her mother, herself an active gardener, why these spaces mattered as much as the culture around her consistently suggested they did. Her mother considered the question with the care it deserved before answering. Gardens, she explained, functioned as the structural opposite of walls. Walls separated whatever existed on either side of them. Gardens connected whatever grew within their shared space. And connection, she told her daughter, was the singular thing that made the broader experience of existing actually worthwhile. The girl asked whether the gardens might eventually disappear, the way the old walls eventually had. Her mother's answer carried the confidence of someone who had witnessed this particular cultural transformation, hold steady across her own lifetime. Not as long as someone continued remembering why they mattered, she said, and remembering was something the culture around them had committed to sustaining indefinitely. The walls of the previous era had been built from fear. The gardens that replaced them were built from love, and love, unlike fear, did not gradually diminish with time. It grew consistently, given even minimal ongoing attention. The girl absorbed this answer and went outside afterward to act on it directly. She planted a single seed in a small pot, modest in scale but genuine in intention, and she watered it daily across the following weeks, watching its slow, undramatic progress toward eventual growth. She learned, through this small personal project, something the broader galactic transformation had been demonstrating at scale for centuries. Gardens were never built in a single decisive moment. They accumulated gradually, through countless smaller moments of sustained attention. And those moments, she discovered through her own patient practice, proved entirely sufficient to produce, eventually, something genuinely worth having grown. 10,000 years had transformed the galaxy into something that exceeded even the optimistic projections of the historians who had documented its earlier stages of transformation. It was not, by any honest accounting, a perfect garden. Droughts still occurred, weeds still required removal, storms still arrived to test whatever had been carefully cultivated in their absence. But it remained, consistently and genuinely, a garden, populated by beings from 1,000 species, who had spent millennia growing alongside one another, learning together, gradually becoming something none of their individual ancestors could have anticipated in isolation. The KRYL Concord had evolved into something its founders would have struggled to recognize by name alone, the KRYL Garden, a designation that reflected accurately what the Federation had actually become rather than what it had originally been called. The Zorn, once the galaxy's most thoroughly isolated species, now ranked among its most enthusiastic and skilled gardeners, their expertise sought by civilizations across the galaxy attempting similar transformations. The humans occupied their now familiar position as quiet keepers, present throughout the galaxy's continued evolution, rarely directing it, consistently tending whatever portion of it fell within their particular care. The walls that had once divided entire civilizations from one another existed now almost exclusively as arches, climbing roses obscuring whatever defensive architecture remained beneath their decorative covering. The gardens of connection had multiplied beyond their original conception into something closer to galactic infrastructure, present on ships, on stations, on every world significant enough to support sustained population, functioning not merely as places of beauty, but as ongoing sites of practice. The practice of presence, the practice of connection, the practice, sustained across 10 millennia, of hope. A human historian named Alara wrote a comprehensive account titled The Garden of the Galaxy, tracing the full arc of transformation from the original walls through their eventual collapse into something her own civilization had helped cultivate but never fully controlled. Her book's closing paragraph achieved the particular distinction of becoming genuinely famous across a galaxy that had, by this point in its history, encountered an enormous accumulated volume of written reflection on its own transformation. They had built walls, she wrote, because they were afraid. They had torn them down because they found, eventually, the courage required to attempt something different. They had planted gardens because hope, once genuinely available, demanded somewhere productive to be directed. The galaxy remained imperfect, but it continued growing, and growth, unlike the walls it had replaced, never definitively stopped. She presented this work at the Garden of Voices, the original sanctuary established on the hidden world where this entire extended transformation had first taken meaningful root. Beings representing 100 species gathered to listen, and they received her conclusions with the particular recognition of an audience that had personally participated in producing the history being described. They nodded. They understood completely, because they had each, in their own modest way, been part of the growth she was describing. And that participation, regardless of its individual scale, had proven entirely sufficient. The Garden of Voices had transformed across the accumulated centuries from a single remarkable tree into something considerably larger and more complex, a forest, genuinely, with each individual tree carrying within its accumulated growth the specific voice of a species, a world, a story that had contributed something irreplaceable to the whole. Visitors moved through this forest the way pilgrims move through genuinely sacred spaces, listening to the whispers that emerged from leaves and branches, feeling the accumulated presence of everyone who had ever previously walked these same paths, and left something of themselves behind. They contributed in turn, seeds left in fertile soil, saplings planted with deliberate care, their own individual voices added to a chorus that had been accumulating for longer than any single visitor's lifetime could fully encompass. The forest functioned, in the understanding of those who maintained and regularly visited it, not as a museum preserving static history, but as a genuinely living archive, continuously growing, continuously receiving new contributions, continuously changing in response to whoever arrived to add their own experience to its accumulated record. A young screamer child visited the forest for the first time, and the experience overwhelmed her in ways her parents had not adequately prepared her to expect. The whispers that filled the space around her carried no specific words she could parse, but they carried something more immediate and more difficult to process selectively, feelings, undifferentiated and arriving simultaneously, grief alongside joy, alongside hope, alongside fear, alongside love, all of it present at once with no apparent mechanism for experiencing them individually rather than as an overwhelming simultaneous whole. She sat down where she stood and wept, unable to maintain her composure against the sheer accumulated weight of what surrounded her. Her mother, a Kryll who had brought her specifically for this experience, settled beside her without attempting to interrupt or redirect the emotional response. She asked gently what her daughter was actually feeling in that overwhelming moment. The child struggled to produce an answer adequate to the complexity of her actual experience. Everything, she finally managed, and nothing, both simultaneously. It was beautiful. It was also somehow equally terrifying. Her mother nodded, recognizing in her daughter's struggle something she herself had once experienced during her own first visit decades earlier. That, she told her, was what it genuinely meant to be alive, to feel the full simultaneous weight of everything available to be felt, to carry that accumulated weight without being permanently crushed beneath it, and to continue, despite the difficulty, growing anyway. The child remained in the forest for a full week following this initial overwhelming encounter. She listened, gradually developing the capacity to distinguish individual voices within the larger accumulated chorus. She eventually added her own contribution, a small whisper, barely audible against the forest's accumulated volume, but genuinely heard nonetheless, and genuinely incorporated into the ongoing chorus that continued, with her modest addition included, to grow. The screamer child who had once been overwhelmed by her first encounter with the Garden of Voices grew, across the subsequent years, into one of its dedicated gardeners, tending the forest's continued expansion, planting new trees alongside the established older growth, nurturing both with the same patient attention. She learned, through years of sustained practice, to listen to the accumulated whispers with increasing precision, and she added her own voice to the ongoing chorus with growing confidence as her understanding deepened. She taught others, eventually, to develop this same capacity for listening, for feeling, for contributing their own voices to something larger than any individual contribution could represent alone. The forest's influence spread beyond its original hidden world to other locations throughout the galaxy. Each new garden connected to the others through the shared seeds and stories that traveled between them. The galaxy gradually transformed into a network of these interconnected forests, each contributing its own accumulated voices to something approaching a genuinely galaxy-spanning chorus. A young human woman visited one of these distributed gardens during a period of genuine personal crisis, not physically lost in any conventional sense, but emotionally adrift in ways that had led her to spend years constructing walls around herself, isolating her own capacity for connection as protection against pain she had previously experienced and feared experiencing again. The forest, true to its established character, offered her no judgment for the walls she had built. It simply held her, the way it had held countless previous visitors carrying their own accumulated burdens. She sat beneath one of the older trees and wept for an extended period, eventually remaining within the forest's care for a full month before she felt prepared to leave. During that extended stay, she learned to listen, gradually, to her own voice, the one she had spent years actively suppressing in service of the protective walls she had constructed. She learned, through the forest's patient example, that the walls she had built had never actually functioned as protection in any genuine sense. They had functioned as a prison, isolating her from exactly the connection that might have helped her process the pain she was attempting to avoid. She left the forest and returned to her own world, having made a decision that reflected everything she had absorbed during her extended stay. She built no walls upon her return. She built, instead, a garden, modest in scale but genuine in intention, and she invited others to sit with her within it, listening to their voices as she had learned to listen within the forest, adding her own voice in turn. Her garden grew. It connected, eventually, to the broader network spreading throughout the galaxy. And the entire accumulated system, the humans had originally taught and the galaxy had subsequently internalized as genuine practice, represented the only walls genuinely worth constructing, walls that did not separate, but connected. Walls that were, in their actual function despite their misleading name, doors. The gardens that had spread throughout the galaxy across these accumulated millennia had evolved beyond their original function as spaces of individual healing and conflict resolution into something closer to the actual organizing infrastructure of galactic civilization itself. From within these spaces, beings organized relief efforts for communities experiencing hardship, educational programs designed to transmit accumulated wisdom across generations, cultural exchanges that maintained the genuine diversity the galaxy had learned to value rather than fear. The gardens functioned, in practice, as the heart of an entire civilization, not through formal governmental structure, but through something closer to genuine community, sustained through the consistent practice of listening, connecting, and growing together. A young Kryll politician, recently elected to a position of genuine leadership responsibility, delivered a significant address from within one of these gardens, rather than from any of the formal political venues her position would have entitled her to use. She sat directly on the grass, surrounded by flowers rather than positioned behind any podium, and addressed her audience with the directness the setting itself seemed to encourage. They were not gathered, she told them, to build walls of any kind. They were gathered to build gardens. Walls divided whatever they enclosed. Gardens, by contrast, united everyone who participated in their cultivation. And unity, her own civilization's painful history had ultimately taught, represented the only force genuinely capable of outlasting any wall, regardless of how thoroughly engineered that wall's original construction might have been. The audience's applause arrived gently rather than thunderously, quiet, sustained, resembling rain falling steadily on leaves rather than any more dramatic acoustic event. The speech traveled throughout the galaxy following its delivery, translated into hundreds of languages, becoming something close to a foundational statement of purpose for the era the galaxy now genuinely inhabited. The galaxy that had once organized itself entirely around the architecture and psychology of walls now organized itself, with equal thoroughness, around the practice of gardens. And the humans, throughout this extended transformation, had consistently emphasized the distinction they considered most essential to preserve going forward. Gardens were never simply places to be visited occasionally, and then left unattended. They were commitments to growth, to connection, to hope sustained across whatever span of time the future required. And commitments, exactly like the gardens they sustained, required ongoing tending rather than one-time establishment. The galaxy, having absorbed this lesson across 10,000 years of accumulated practice, stood ready to continue that tending. Not merely for the present moment. Forever, for as long as forever proved to require. The story that had begun with an empire's collapsing walls did not settle into static legend the way most historical events eventually do once enough time separates the present from their original occurrence. It continued, instead, as a genuinely living presence, the walls that had once divided the galaxy now standing as arches covered in roses, the gardens that had replaced them still growing, still blooming, still connecting beings who would otherwise have remained isolated from one another. The humans who had originally set this entire extended transformation into motion occupied, by this point in the galaxy's accumulated history, a position considerably quieter than their initial demonstration of capability might have suggested. They had become, simply and consistently, part of the garden itself, not leaders directing its continued growth, but keepers tending soil, watering seeds, sitting in patient silence with whoever arrived seeking exactly that kind of presence. They had taught the galaxy, across this extended accumulated history, that walls were never genuinely the answer to whatever problem had originally motivated their construction. Gardens were. And this lesson, transmitted initially through the most expensive possible demonstration imaginable, had gradually transformed into something the galaxy now simply understood as foundational truth, requiring no further demonstration to remain credible. A child was born on a distant world, in a garden that had once, in its previous historical existence, served as an active battlefield before the broader transformation reached even this remote location. She grew up surrounded by flowers, by accumulated stories, by the genuine connection that had become her civilization's default condition rather than its aspiration. She learned, gradually and through the patient accumulated teaching of her elders, that her ancestors had originally built walls because fear had seemed, at the time, like an entirely reasonable response to genuine uncertainty. She learned that those same ancestors had eventually torn the walls down because courage, once genuinely accessed, proved capable of overcoming fear's initial hold. She learned that she herself was part of the garden that had resulted from this difficult historical progression, part of its continued growth, part of the hope that had been so carefully and deliberately cultivated across the generations preceding her own. On her 10th birthday, she visited the Garden of Voices for the first time in person, rather than through the stories that had described it to her throughout her childhood. She walked through the accumulated forest, feeling its whispers, listening to stories that connected her to a history she had previously known only secondhand. She found, eventually, a tree that carried her own family's name among its accumulated voices. She placed her hand against its bark and whispered a single word into the surrounding silence. "Thank you." The tree offered no audible response, but she felt something nonetheless, a warmth, a presence, the unmistakable sensation of being genuinely held by something larger than herself. The garden was holding her, she understood in that moment. She was not alone. She somehow knew with complete certainty, never truly be alone again. And that, she recognized even at 10 years old, represented the single greatest gift her entire accumulated history had ultimately produced. The child grew, across the years that followed her 10th birthday visit, into precisely the kind of gardener that her civilization's accumulated history had prepared her to become. She tended the Garden of Voices with the same patient dedication her predecessors had brought to the same work across the preceding millennia, planting new trees, adding new stories to the forest's continuously expanding chorus. She sought, throughout this extended career, neither fame nor any formal position of authority. What she sought, consistently and deliberately, was connection, the same quality her entire civilization had organized itself around achieving since the original transformation that had reshaped everything preceding her own existence. She learned, through years of accumulated practice and reflection, that the walls her distant ancestors had originally built had never actually been the genuine enemy in the larger historical narrative she had inherited. The fear that had motivated their construction was the actual problem requiring address. Similarly, she came to understand that gardens themselves were not automatically the complete answer to whatever challenges her civilization continued encountering. The love required to tend them properly was the genuine mechanism producing whatever benefit the gardens ultimately provided. She spent her adult life sharing this hard-won understanding, though never through formal lecture or structured instruction. She taught, instead, through sustained presence, sitting with beings experiencing grief, anger, or genuine loss, offering them not advice or attempted solutions but simply silence, space, and when appropriate, a hand available to hold. A young Veth, observing her sustained commitment to this quiet work, eventually asked why she dedicated herself so consistently to it. She answered with a smile that reflected genuine, rather than performed warmth. Someone had done exactly this for her, long ago, during a period of her own life she did not elaborate on further. They had sat with her in silence. They had held her hand without attempting to immediately resolve whatever she had been struggling with. They had simply remained present. That sustained presence, she told her young questioner, had changed everything about how she subsequently approached her own difficulties. The Veth asked whether this work ever exhausted her. She laughed, an honest rather than deflecting response. Every single day, she acknowledged. But being tired was not equivalent to being finished, and she had not yet, by her own internal assessment, reached that particular conclusion. She continued her work following this exchange exactly as she had continued it before. Another seed planted, another story shared, another voice received with the same patient attention she had always brought to this calling. The garden continued growing in response to her sustained effort. The broader galaxy continued healing, incrementally and imperfectly alongside it. Not perfectly, not permanently in any absolute sense, but sufficiently, she had concluded across her years of accumulated experience and sufficiency, she had come to genuinely believe, represented all that anyone authentically required. The gardener's life extended across a span long enough to witness multiple subsequent generations pass through the world she had spent her career tending. She watched the gardens continue their accumulated growth. She watched the walls, transformed permanently into arches, continue accumulating their decorative covering of climbing roses. She watched the broader galaxy, gradually and consistently, become more genuinely connected than it had been during any previous period of its accumulated history. She never sought personal credit for any meaningful portion of this extended transformation, consistently redirecting whatever praise reached her toward the actual mechanisms she considered genuinely responsible: the seeds themselves, the soil that received them, the patient silence that had originally listened carefully enough to make everything subsequent possible. When her own extended life finally approached its natural conclusion, she made a single, specific request of the family gathered around her during her final days. Plant a seed, she asked them, anywhere genuinely suitable for her. They honored this request precisely as she had specified, planting a seed taken directly from the Garden of Voices in a small garden positioned just outside the window of the room where she lay during her final days. It grew, in the limited time remaining to her, into a young sapling, carrying within its early growth the particular quality every previous contribution to this accumulated garden had eventually developed: voice, presence, connection extending forward into whatever future awaited it beyond her own remaining lifespan. She died peacefully, her hand resting against the soil she had dedicated her entire career to tending, and the young tree's leaves, even at this early stage of its development, seemed to whisper something resembling her own name back to her. She was not, in any sense her own life's accumulated work had taught her to recognize as meaningful, simply gone following this transition. She persisted in the roots continuing to develop beneath the soil she had tended. She persisted in the branches that would continue extending toward whatever light eventually reached them. She persisted in the seeds her own tree would eventually produce and scatter forward into gardens she would never personally witness. She had become, through her death exactly as thoroughly as through her preceding life, genuinely part of the cycle she had spent decades deliberately cultivating, part of the garden, part of the galaxy she had helped, in her own consistently modest way, to grow. That had always been, by her own explicit accounting across her many years of reflection, entirely sufficient. Not victory in any conventional sense. Not conquest of any kind. A seed, planted with genuine love. A life, lived in sustained connection. A voice, heard once, that would never genuinely fall silent. It would continue growing. It would continue blooming. It would become, eventually and through the same patient accumulated process that had produced everything preceding it, a wall, though not, this time, a wall of separation. A wall of connection. The story that had begun with an empire's collapsing gravitational walls did not conclude with any single individual's death, because stories organized around the principle of continuous growth do not, by their fundamental nature, conclude in any final sense. They continue growing. They branch outward. They scatter forward, the way seeds scatter, carrying themselves into conditions and locations their original source could never have specifically anticipated. The walls that had once divided the galaxy so thoroughly now stood, universally, as arches rather than barriers. The gardens that had originally been small and tentative now spanned vast distances, connecting worlds that had once maintained no relationship with one another whatsoever. The galaxy, once organized entirely around division and the architecture that sustained it, now organized itself around connection instead, not through any imposed force, but through accumulated, genuine choice, renewed consistently across generation after generation. A child was born on a world distant enough from the original site of transformation that she possessed no direct awareness yet of the walls, the gardens, or the extended lesson that had connected them across the accumulated centuries. But she would learn in time, exactly as every preceding generation had learned. She would hear the foundational story. She would feel, eventually, the same invitation that the original demonstration had extended, and that every subsequent gardener had continued extending forward across the intervening millennia. She would plant her own seed. She would tell her own version of the accumulated story. She would practice the discipline of listening that her entire civilization had organized itself around, and in doing so, she would become another link in a cycle that had originally begun with a single difficult question. What do you actually need? The cycle had continued through a single difficult lesson, that walls, left unexamined, could ultimately kill, while gardens, properly tended, could genuinely heal. The cycle would never fully conclude, because beings would always, to some degree, build walls in response to fear, and beings would always, eventually, learn to dismantle them in response to something more durable than fear. The humans, who had originally initiated this entire extended cycle, had become, across the accumulated centuries, simply part of its established rhythm, gardeners themselves now, keepers, quiet voices present within whatever silence the moment required. They had taught the galaxy, through the most expensive possible demonstration and the patient millennia of cultivation that followed it, that walls were never genuinely the answer to whatever problem had originally motivated their construction. Gardens were, and the galaxy, after this extended and difficult accumulated journey, had finally and genuinely learned this lesson. Not perfectly, not permanently in any absolute sense that precluded future difficulty, but sufficiently to continue growing, sufficiently to continue connecting, sufficiently to continue hoping. And sufficiency, the humans had always understood even from their earliest involvement in this extended story, was genuinely all that anyone authentically required. The seeds had been planted. The gardens continued growing. The galaxy continued becoming, gradually and consistently, more fully itself. And somewhere, within the accumulated heart of one particular garden among the countless thousands now scattered throughout galactic civilization, a single flower bloomed. It required no walls surrounding it. It needed none whatsoever. It existed simply and completely as itself. And that, the accumulated wisdom of this extended history had ultimately concluded, represented the single greatest lesson the entire story had to offer.